My name is Sarah Brown, and I am the Executive Director here at the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education. We are housed at Brookdale Community College on the territory of the Lenni Lenape people. This week marks 83 years since the November Pogrom. On November 8th, 83 years ago, in 1938, the Nazis, helped by many ordinary people, young and old, instigated a nationwide pogrom that destroyed 267 synagogues and thousands of Jewish homes and businesses. They also deported 30,000 Jewish men to concentration camps. The events came to be known as Cristalnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, because of the shattered glass that littered the streets after the vandalism and destruction of those Jewish-owned homes, businesses, and synagogues. Here at Chhange, we deliberately refer to Kristallnacht as the November Pogrom, reflecting the language commonly used by survivors in our community and beyond to describe the mass violence they experienced over those nights. Often, Kristallnacht, or November Pogrom, is commemorated over a 2-day period, November 9th and 10th. We also commemorate November 11th because the violence continued as many Jewish men were arrested and deported on that day. The November Pogrom marks a turning point for many of the Jewish people who were living in Germany. Though the shock from the mass violence extended beyond Germany, it also stunned, it stunned the international community as well. As my beloved mentor and the author of Holocaust: A History, Dr. Georg, once wrote, with the November Pogrom, the plight of Jews in Germany changed radically. For a long while, many had believed that the Nuremberg laws conferred stability. Jews would be outcasts, but still tolerated. This myth vanished overnight, literally went up in smoke. Unfortunately, this new realization converged with the tightening of immigration opportunities after the ill-fated Evian conference. Too few Jews found escape routes out of Germany, and later, when World War II began, those few routes were sealed. This myth of being outcast but tolerated, or even more so as being citizens, was especially powerful for Jewish veterans of World War I, whose patriotism and leadership had served as an example for Jewish and non-Jewish Germans alike. Tonight's commemorative program will drill down on the experiences of these Jewish World War I veterans who were specifically targeted during the November pogroms because of their heroic and patriotic past. It will also detail how they resisted. Just a couple of housekeeping items before I hand things over to tonight's speaker, Dr. Mike Geheran. Your audio will remain muted throughout the program, but the chat feature is enabled, so please feel free to communicate with one another. And at the end of the presentation, please feel free to type your questions into the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can as possible. And before we begin, I would like to thank Chhange staff Allie Evans, Spencer Cronin, and Susan Yellen for making tonight's program possible. And a very, very, very warm thank you to our program sponsor, the B'nai Shalom Foundation, Beth El, Congregation Torat El. We are so grateful for your ongoing partnership and support. And now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, who is also my colleague and former classmate, Dr. Michael Geheran. Dr. Geheran is Assistant Professor of History and the Deputy Director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Prior to coming to West Point, Geheran taught at the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies at Boston University. He was a Fulbright Scholar in Germany from 2011 until 2012, and his research has been supported by grants from the German Academic Exchange Service, the German Historical Institute, the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. His first book, Comrades Betrayed: Jewish World War I Veterans Under Hitler, was published by Cornell University Press in 2020. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Geheran, and I will mute myself and hand things over to you.
Can everybody hear me okay? I think I'm unmuted.
Yep.
Thank you so much for that. First off, thank you everybody for coming today, and thank you, Sarah, for that wonderful and very generous introduction. Thank you, Spencer, for all your hard work and organizing the event. Thank you, Elie, and thank you to everybody at Chhange for inviting me. It is a real honor to be here today. And we're here to commemorate the 83rd anniversary of Kristallnacht, or the November Pogrom, as Sarah said. And this was a watershed in the history of German Jewry. It was a watershed really in every sense of that word, because by the end of that year, during the pogrom, and by the end of 1938, virtually no Jewish businesses in Germany remained intact. Most Jewish wealth and property had been or was about to be confiscated. And much of the male population aged between 18 to 65 had been imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps. Jews throughout Germany, they suffered the humiliation of arrest and physical abuse during the pogrom. And even those who escaped the violence, even those that were unscathed by the events of 9 and 10 November, they were confronted with the powerlessness of being unable to defend their homes and their families, and racked by the uncertainty of what lay ahead. And this marked the beginning of a prolonged struggle for existence that not all German Jews would survive. So what I'm going to do today, what I'd like to do today is tell you a little bit of a different story about the November Pogrom than you're used to hearing. And even though, despite its tragic ending, it demonstrates that not all Jews were rendered powerless under the Nazi reign of terror. It's quite fitting that tomorrow is also Veterans Day, at least here in the United States, because today I wanted to share the stories of Jewish former soldiers, those men who had worn the Kaiser's uniform during World War I, and how they experienced the pogrom, the 3 nights of violence, as well as a 4-week ordeal in the Nazi concentration camps. And I want to start off with a quote by a man named Alfred Schwerin, who was arrested on 10 November and deported to a camp 1 or 2 days afterwards. And when he arrived at the infamous concentration camp at Dachau, he wrote in his memoirs and a testimony he composed shortly after, he wrote that, quote, "Never have I seen so many men cry as at Dachau." And what's interesting about this quote is that that Schwerin was not referring to himself. He related these events to us as an observer, not as a victim. He was talking about the other prisoners at Dachau here. He himself, like all the other prisoners, he was subjected to horrific privations at the Nazi concentration camp: fear, uncertainty, hunger, illness, severe mental and physical abuse. But he was able to overcome these trials. He was able to surmount these hardships by maintaining his composure, by not allowing himself to be cowed into submission. And he goes on to write, quote, "From the very beginning, I was determined to rise to the occasion, to persevere and make it out in one piece. I did not allow anything to keep me down in Dachau, neither the frozen extremities, the despair of the other inmates, nor the sinister environment we found ourselves in. I can think of no other time in my life where my self-reliance and self-confidence had been as strong." Schwerin goes on to credit this resilience to his time in the army, where he had served 4 years on the Western Front as a non-commissioned officer. Dachau didn't impress him. The tight living quarters, the poor sanitation, the lack of privacy, lack of food, none of this intimidated, but it reminded him of what he already endured years ago as a soldier in the army. Schwerin's attitude, his resolve, his determination to overcome these hardships, they stood in contrast to the powerlessness of the other prisoners. Those Jews who had not served in the army, those Jews who had not served in the war, who had been seemingly left to their fate and were resigned. So at least this is how Schwerin presents himself in his testimonies, in his writings. And in many ways, what I found interesting about this testimony and others like it is that it really presents a challenge to these existing narrative of the November Pogrom, which contends that Jews have been rendered powerless and helpless by Nazi terror. And one of the problems, I think, or one of the issues with existing histories of the Holocaust that focus on Jewish victims is that until now, they haven't really given any attention to the military background of Jewish veterans. And I think this was this is a major oversight, because fighting in World War I and fighting and serving in the military in general, it had a significant impact on Jews' identity, how they saw themselves, how they wanted to be seen by others. It affected how they carried themselves in public. It affected how they reacted to anti-Semitism. And it also affected how they coped under Nazi persecution. And serving in the war, or fighting in the war, serving in the military, this was central to veterans' identity, because as we read these memoirs, as we look at testimonies of Kristallnacht, it's really fascinating that 20 years after the conflict, they're still writing about this experience as if it's the central part of their lives. They emphasize concepts such as honor, manhood, and courage. They write about the ability to prove oneself, and not just, on the battlefields of Flanders in 1914, but also against Nazi thugs on the streets of Berlin in 1933. These traits, these behaviors, they mattered immensely to this generation of Jewish men. So after 4 years of fighting in the trenches, Jewish veterans, they saw themselves as kind of a masculine elite. These were men who had demonstrated their masculinity, their manhood, through participation in war. And in many ways, veterans, they contradicted the Nazi stereotype of the Jew. Anti-Semitic caricatures at this time, they portrayed Jews really in very much the same way, Jewish men the same way, as short, stocky, overweight, with fat protruding bellies, ungroomed beards. And really, this was the antithesis of the German military male. And soldiering, having come back from World War I, having been wounded, having fought in the trenches, having been decorated, this really was a means for Jewish men to turn this stereotype, these negative stereotypes, on their head. And after World War I, when anti-Semitic activists accused Jews of having been complicit in Germany's downfall, of having stabbed Germany in the back, veterans not only used their war medals to silence their accusers, but they also were very engaged in projecting a physically strong, assertive Jewish male image to counter this anti-Semitic propaganda. My intent here, though, in talking about veterans during Kristallnacht, it's not to refute the existing scholarship on the pogrom, but rather to complicate it. I want to, my goal is to add an existing dimension to it by thinking about how veterans like Alfred Schwerin experienced the pogrom, how he coped in the Nazi concentration camps, and how he was seemingly able to avoid the fate of so many other Jewish victims. And I have a short PowerPoint here that I want to share with you, a couple of images, and I'm going to bring that up. Just give me a moment here. Maybe that should have already been up there before. That's the title of my presentation, but I think if you're here, you already know as much. That's it. So here is a picture of Richard Stern in Cologne during the April boycott. And I wanted, before we move on to Kristallnacht, I wanted to take a step back and look at the regime's treatment of Jewish veterans in the early Nazi years. And from the beginning, the persecution of Jewish veterans, this was a thorny issue for the Nazis. Their first attempt to exclude all Jews from German public life in 1933 failed, mainly because of the intervention of Reich President Hindenburg and other conservatives in the government. Most ordinary Germans they objected to the persecution of war veterans. Although many Germans, they believed in the regime's anti-Semitic ideology. At the same time, there was some solidarity with Jews whom they knew, Jews who they'd done business with, Jews who they had served with during the war. And here you see Richard Stern during the April boycott, and you can see here that this is an awkward moment for the SA troop. That's for the SA men who are standing in front of his shop. They almost seem diminished by Stern's presence. And as a result of this discomfort that you see here, many Germans complained, and they objected to the public treatment, the public shaming of war veterans. And so early on, there was a series of exemptions for Jewish veterans. In 1933, the first anti-Semitic laws, which excluded Jews from the civil service law, Vice President Hindenburg ordered Hitler to make an exemption for Jewish veterans. And this really started a pattern here that was evident throughout the entire Third Reich. After every anti-Semitic law was passed, the Nazis were forced to rescind it and to make it include an exemption for Jewish veterans. This so-called Jewish Veterans Clause, as it was known, or Frontkämpferklausel, it remained in effect until 1938, and it's true that it was rescinded by the Nuremberg laws at that time. But many Jewish veterans, their exemptions lasted well until 1938. For example, while Jewish lawyers were largely disbarred after 1935, there was an exemption for veterans, and they remained in their posts until 1938, until Kristallnacht. The same with Jewish doctors as well. They also had a provision where frontline veterans were allowed to remain in their posts. And until that time, many Jewish veterans did not suffer the fate of other Jews in Germany during that time. But I think the Veterans Clause did more than just allow some veterans to keep their jobs. It established Jewish veterans as a status group in Nazi Germany. And this status was relative. It didn't bestow veterans with any official power or influence. It did not give them any kind of access to resources that other Jews didn't have, but it created a category that separated them from quote unquote ordinary Jews. Veterans were a group that was nominally entitled to rights, privileges, and exceptions. And this dichotomy entered public discourse in Nazi Germany, enabled Jewish veterans to defy the Nazi category, quote unquote, Jude, and be considered members of a subordinate yet privileged minority. And as I mentioned, the early Nazi years had shown that the abusive ex-servicemen did not sit well with the German public, and this affected how Jewish veterans were treated. You know, it affected their fate during on November 9th and during the 3 days of terror that racked Germany during the pogrom. These exemptions that we just mentioned, this state of affairs all came crashing down on 9 November 1938. And many veterans, they did suffer beatings, harassment, and vandalism to their properties. And veterans were among the 30,000 Jewish men that were arrested and deported to Nazi concentration camps. And from the regime's perspective, this targeting of veterans, it was not accidental, it was calculated. This physical abuse, this public shaming, and it was intended to show the victims, as well as the German people, that all Jews were the same in Hitler's Germany, that there would be no more exemptions or legal exemptions, that there would be no more exceptions for any particular class of Jew, especially for veterans. So on the surface, they suffered they suffered the same fate as many of the other Jewish men. But if we look at how the pogrom played out on the local level, a far more complicated picture emerges. And I want to look at one particular town, which is Würzburg, which is unique for several reasons. Würzburg is a small city in Franconia. Franconia was a Nazi stronghold even before 1933, before Hitler was appointed chancellor. The Nazi party had been doing very well in the elections there, so it was a bastion of Nazi support. And it's the one place in Germany, one of three cities in Germany where the Gestapo records survived the war, Gestapo and police records. So we have a very clear picture here of what happened, who was arrested, and we have a very valuable trove of witness accounts from here as well, court records, testimonies, and together they can give us some insights on how this played out and how it affected war veterans. And these records, they show that in some cases, veterans were able to evade arrest and the violence on the night of 9 and 10 November. And they did this by making an impression on the perpetrators, by identifying themselves as former soldiers of the Great War. In Estenfeld, for example, a suburb of Würzburg, during the night of pogrom, a former officer and holder of the Iron Cross First Class, he managed to make his way to the town hall where he pleaded with the mayor to spare his home from demolition and his family from being arrested. And the mayor, a Nazi party member, of course, he acquiesced and he ordered the SA leader to leave the man's house alone. In the case of Albert Dreyfus, the SA men that forced their way into his home, it was led by a regular policeman, an undercover Kripo officer. And after entering his apartment, they noticed the officer's saber, and the policeman ordered him to produce some evidence of his wartime service. After the officer checked his military records, he ordered his men to leave, and they left Dreyfus alone. And according to Dreyfus, the police officer said, quote, "With you, we'll leave everything as it is." And he departed. And he even gave Dreyfus his number, his name, and the phone, well, not number, but the phone number of the police station in case other SA men arrived that day. And in the case of Joseph Levy, also in Würzburg, through a miracle, quote unquote, through a miracle, both him and his son, both veterans actually, they survived unscathed after presenting their military ID to the SA men. And Levy wrote, quote, "This made an impression on these ignorant chaps, and they left us in our apartment alone." So we see here from these examples, and there are many more examples that I can give you. But just by looking at these three examples, we see that under certain conditions, invocations of past military service offered some protection, especially when dealing with regular law enforcement officers or quote unquote moderate members of the Nazi party. And that's definitely quote signs around that moderate. But interestingly enough, too, is that these testimonies suggest, based on these records, is that the SA men and policemen who were involved in that, they did this. They spared these Jewish veterans, sometimes their comrades, without fear of repercussions. They weren't challenged or overruled by their colleagues, nor was there any kind of, did it seem to defy the norm to give preferential treatment to old comrades or to certain Jews. And again, this goes that this is veterans were a status group in German society. And in a way, by 1938, this was still, in a way, it was expected. Even more remarkable is the story of this man here, Julius Kutzmann. Kutzmann was a former officer. He was highly decorated. He won both classes of the Iron Cross in World War I. He'd been a Freikorps officer after the war and helped put down the communist insurrection in Munich. And he was a successful co-owner of a textile business in Würzburg, a business that remained solvent until the pogrom, until 1938. Not only did it just remain solvent, but he was actually doing fairly well in 1938. Würzburg, it was a university city, and it was also a garrison town. There was an infantry regiment stationed there. And Kutzmann, as a former officer, he regularly, he spent time, he hung out with officers, sometimes in uniform, to the disapproval of the local Gestapo. But until 1938, he seemed to live a normal middle-class existence, on the surface, despite Nazi provocation and harassment. He was arrested after the pogrom on 10 November, and his arrest prompted a backlash in the town, and it resulted in maybe the only documented collective intervention in Nazi Germany during the pogrom. And by the way, the pictures you see here, those are pictures from Katzmann's Gestapo file. Those are Gestapo mug shots. When you were arrested by the Gestapo, they usually took these photographs like this from these three angles. So these are right. This was him on the morning of 10 November and shortly after his arrest. So after they learned of his arrest, Katzmann's employees, he employed about 25 employees, they wrote a petition to the Reichschancellery in Berlin, directly to Hitler, asking for their bosses released. Some of the people who helped write this petition, they were members of the Nazi Party. And the petition writers signed it. They're all 25 signatures are still available on that document. I was going to put it on the PowerPoint, but it just ended up too small, so it was barely legible, but it really is a remarkable document. And as far as I know, this is the only collective intervention during this time, at least the only one that we have a record of. And the people who wrote this petition, they articulated their appeal by reminding Hitler that Katzmann had been an officer in the German army during World War I. In his service during the war and after the war, battling communists, his military record, all this had, quote unquote, proven his Germanness. And this is something we hear quite often when we see interventions made by ordinary Germans on behalf of Jewish comrades. They state that fighting in the war had proven their Germanness, and I think this is where you see a difference between ordinary Germans or the conservative middle classes. Both of them were they shared many of the much of the anti-Semitism of the Nazi Party, but still they made distinctions. Jews who had performed a particular service or had fought in the war, they were somehow seemed of having proven themselves and having earned their citizenship, their place in society. Now you can turn that around, of course, and say that explicitly that Jews who hadn't served in the war, they have no place in German society. This is still an anti-Semitic position, but still this is common within the conservative middle classes in Germany, these distinctions. Anyway, back to Katzmann. They also sent a second petition to Munich, to the Reich governor in Munich of Bavaria. And these interventions were successful. The one that went to Bavaria apparently was instrumental in gaining Katzmann's release from Buchenwald. He was released 7 days after he was first arrested and interred. And he was allowed to go home, where he immigrated with his family to New York about a year and a half later in April 1940. And so the interesting thing here is that there were no consequences for the petition writers. The Gestapo, there was a follow-up investigation looking into it, but the results of that investigation were largely inconclusive. The Gestapo wrote very vaguely that probably a Jew was involved in this, and that this wasn't authentic. This was an exceptional case. And before I move on, I wanted to show you another picture that I gleaned from the Gestapo files in Würzburg. And this is a man by the name of Georg Lieberman. And Mr. Lieberman, he was also a veteran. He was not a frontline veteran. He served behind the lines during the war because of his age. But on Kristallnacht, on the 10th of November, his home was also attacked. And the SA men broke into his apartment while he was still sleeping. And while he was still in his night clothes, they dragged him from his bedroom down the stairs and out into the streets. And they beat him so badly that he lost consciousness. He was dragged to the Gestapo police station, where they photographed him. And these are his mug shots here. He was briefly brought back to consciousness. And you can see here, if you look closely, his blood-stained nightshirt that was covered with a jacket that the Gestapo threw on him just for the purpose of the photograph. Lieberman, he died a couple hours after this photograph was taken. He was brought from the Gestapo station to the hospital, and by the time he arrived, he was pronounced dead. So this was very uncommon with Julius Kutzmann. Many veterans suffered this fate, and yeah, it was a highly unusual case. So I just this is just a reminder that the veterans who were saved, the ones who were broken out by their comrades, that these were unusual cases, and certainly did not reflect the fate of all Jewish veterans, even former officers during the pogrom. So even though some veterans did, we mentioned some cases where they were able to evade arrest, they were among the 30,000 Jewish men who were arrested and delivered into the custody of the SS at Buchenwald, at Sachsenhausen, and at Dachau. Those were the three concentration camps that existed in Germany at the time. And if the Nazis had shown any restraint in public, in front of crowds of ordinary Germans, all that restraint evaporated and melted away as soon as the victims were inside the barbed wire enclosures and watchtowers of the camp. And from the moment they arrived at these places, it became abundantly clear to the victims that what kind of horrors awaited them inside the gates. And I'm going to read another quote from Karl Rosenthal, who was also a veteran as he arrived at Sachsenhausen, in his testimony that he wrote down shortly after. And he said, quote, "We immediately heard deafening voices yelling at us, 'Out, you Jewish pigs, off the truck.' As we hurried to jump from the truck, several SS armed men with their clubs and whips unleashed on us. Amid nasty epithets and screaming, their blows came down on us mercilessly, on our backs, on our legs, our heads, and across our faces. One of my less fortunate comrades was thrown from the truck with such force that he remained lying in the ground, motionless, a large wound on his head and forehead, blood streaming over his face and over his jacket," unquote. Many veterans, when they arrived at Dachau and Sachsenhausen, they brought their medals with it, their military ID cards, hoping that this would make an impression on the SS. After all, this is what they had done in the years before 1938. But they quickly learned that this was not only would this not make a favorable impression on the guards, but this was actually dangerous. The SS guards at the camps, they responded with particular savagery against any Jews claiming German identity. Siegfried Neumann, he's another veteran who was interred at Sachsenhausen. He brought his medals to the camp, and he was immediately told by an older inmate to ditch his medals, to get rid of them. And it became clear to Neumann exactly why that was. He described how another prisoner reported, how another prisoner on his arrival, a 60-year-old man, arrived there with walking on a crutch. And on his jacket, he had affixed to his lapels an Iron Cross First Class and wound badge that he'd earned during the war. When one of the SS guards spotted him, he snatched the crutch from under the man and used it to beat him over the head. And this is Neumann writing here. The following day, this old veteran was forced to stand at attention for 11 hours on the parade ground in formation despite his prosthetic leg. Every time he lost strength, several blows from an SS guard ensured that he came to his senses again. And here is one of the rare pictures we have from Dachau, and it shows that prisoners were forced to stand at attention for hours at a time, 11 hours, 12 hours a day. They were forced to stand there. This is one of the methods of torture that the SS used, including veterans, many of them who had been disabled during the war, like this man. At Buchenwald again, another inmate describes how a new arrival went as far as reproaching the guards for their dishonorable treatment of former officers and recipients of the Iron Cross. This particular man was immediately subjected to a rain of blows from the SS, and he was dragged to the main parade ground, tied face down on a wooden plank, shirt removed before the assembled inmates, and lashed 25 times on his back with a thin wooden rod. The man screams, another inmate wrote, stayed with, quote unquote, stayed with me for days. So on the surface, the writings of Jewish veterans don't really differ that much from other victims of Kristallnacht. And again, as I read many testimonies from non-veterans and from war veterans as well. And on the surface, they both describe the savagery of SS guards. They describe the appalling living conditions of the camp, overcrowded, dirty barracks, lack of drinking water, lack of food, latrines overflowing with feces. They describe chronic thirst, chronic hunger, dysentery, infections, people committing suicides, and individuals just completely losing their minds. This was a regular feature of life in the camp, and veterans and non-veterans, they describe these alike. But what really, when reading the testimonies of veterans, what really stands out is that their military background from the very beginning, their training fulfilled a vital psychological as well as a practical need. Because on a basic level, the fact that Jewish former soldiers were familiar with the drill, with the commands and the codes of discipline of the German military, it helped them endure the initial shock of the camp, their arrival at the camp. It helped them adapt to the environment. And one of the things I noticed looking at, by reading non-veteran prisoner accounts, is that they suffered severely at the very beginning because they found it hard to adjust to the military way of speaking. The harsh language, the commands, the senseless marching back and forth as they wrote it. Hans Berger, who was a veteran interred at Sachsenhausen, he wrote that the SS guards there really reminded him of the worst Prussian non-commissioned officer and sadist, combined many times over and over. These are his words. He remembered the military commands and the proper way to march from his time in the army, and he knew what had to be done. Hans Reichmann, who was also a veteran from the war and an officer, he wrote after the pogrom, quote, "Almost all of us in our barracks have been soldiers, many of us officers. We pull ourselves together and we stand tall." And interesting here is in their writings, in their testimonies written immediately after, it seems that World War I, that the military, that their service became kind of a reference point for these Jewish prisoners. They contrasted the discipline, the regimen of the camp, the deprivations and the unpredictability of the concentration camp. They compared this with the conditions they faced in the barracks yard or while they were in the trenches of the Western Front some 20 years before. They equated with the hardships they experienced, quote unquote, back then, the shortages of food and clothing, the close living space, lack of privacy, lack of personal hygiene, fear of being wounded. They equated this with what they were experiencing under the Nazis at Dachau. And now, to be sure, physical survival was paramount here. I mean, this was the foremost concern of all inmates for the camps, veterans as well as non-veterans. But again, as we read the testimonies of veterans, it's interesting that Jewish former soldiers, they also strove to do more than survive physically, but they sought to preserve their dignity, their masculine self-worth, their honor. And they did this by enduring the hardships of the SS, by not being broken. And as mentioned before, when I started, I mentioned a quote by Alfred Schwerin when he wrote that he'd never seen so many men cry as at Dachau. This was, he was talking about the other victims. He was writing there as an observer. His own confidence, his own resolve his ability to withstand the hardships there. He contrasted this with the helplessness of the other prisoners, the ones who were crying, the ones who were breaking down, those who would resign themselves to their fate. And he makes it clear that Schwerin makes it clear, and other veterans, that despite attempts by the SS to strip away the last vestiges of his soldierly identity, his dignity, that they were not without power, that they were not relegated to impotence here. Now, to be sure, the abuse that veterans suffered, they had this undoubtedly had a damaging effect on them. They were traumatized in ways that we can never know. But when we look at their writings, they suggest, at least this is how they portray themselves, they state that this shame was mitigated by taking action, by not being reduced to passivity. And for many veterans interned in the camps, taking action meant maintaining their composure, by maintaining their military bearing. This included acting as protectors and father figures, for example, to the weaker prisoners. This is a big kind of a leitmotif in veterans' writings. Schwerin himself, he described comforting several quote unquote hysterical prisoners or deeply shaken inmates. His perseverance and his determination, they served as a power of example to many of them. These are his words, the words that he uses. Another veteran, Heinrich Lichtenstein, also at Buchenwald, he relates how he consoled, quote, countless fellow inmates who were in shock, who could no longer hold themselves together spiritually. We made sure that they cleaned their clothes and shoes, that they retrieved the rations allocated to them, and that they ate and they drank. Invoking his own experiences during the war, Lichtenstein says that his personal example galvanized many of the weaker prisoners and quote unquote motivated them to pull through. And again, this is an interesting thread we see in a lot of veterans' writings. And implicit in this rhetoric, I think, is a kind of moral superiority here over non-military Jews. Veterans saw themselves as, or they at least they portrayed themselves as experienced men. These were men who had been tried and tested in battle. They were proven leaders, and they were masculine role models who could instill courage and determination into quote unquote weaker prisoners. And very much so, I think this is still part and parcel of veterans' identity today. I think that this is universal, certainly not unique to Germany or unique to Jewish veterans during World War II. According to another veteran at Dachau, Hans Block, several World War I veterans in the barracks, they even formed an internal guard troop. This is how he phrases it, a quote unquote guard troop. Whose job was to maintain discipline among the other prisoners in the barracks in order to prevent unnecessary run-ins with the SS. I mean, all these other hysterical prisoners, they were creating attention and that attracted the SS. And this guard troop sought to prevent that. And prisoners who did not comply, who did not follow directions were, quote, made obedient by blows, if necessary, unquote. Taking action meant engaging even in small-scale acts of defiance. Even limited self-destructive acts were used to alleviate the shame of powerlessness and give veterans some agency in the camps. Kurt Sabusky, who was at Buchenwald, he was a former officer. He describes another inmate, one of his colleagues, who was also a former officer, as he was attacked by an SS guard. The SS guard repeatedly struck this man in the face, and he demanded that the inmate repeat the words, "I am a traitor to the fatherland." When the former officers refused to do that, he was repeatedly struck in the face by the sadistic SS guard. And despite blood being starting to flow from his nose, from his mouth, the man refused to utter those words. And in doing so, he became a kind of a symbol of defiance for Sabusky. And in a way, I mean, if we put ourselves in his shoes, it would have just been easier and much more simpler for this inmate to, to follow the guard's demands. but it was exactly this that made this act of defiance so remarkable. This man endured a beating rather than quote unquote surrender. This is how veterans phrase this. And this action, it galvanized many of the other inmates, including Sabatsky. And there was a certain pride expressed by the few veterans who were able to act in defense of honor. And it throws, I think it says something about how veterans saw themselves, and also throws light on an important aspect of Jewish agency in the camps. I think this correlation between action and masculinity, right? By taking action. This is borne out in numerous testimonies. Now, again, not all veterans had the ability to act like this, of course, but those who did it, they saw it as an important element in sustaining their morale and also in sustaining a strong male identity. Also very important here. I am going to, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, I think. Okay, so to the 29th of November, 1938, an order issued by Hermann Göring released all frontline veterans from the camps, all those who had been arrested during Kristallnacht. And this brought their 4-week ordeal to an end. And as other victims of the pogrom, they were still incarcerated. Many of the Jewish men who were arrested after Kristallnacht, they were not allowed to leave until their wives or their families produced emigration papers giving proof that they were to leave Germany. But Jewish veterans, they were released, they were paroled, in early December, and they were allowed to return home. And as news of this order spread through the camp, there was a sense of elation among the Jewish veterans, of course. And this moment was described by a man by the name of Kurt Guggenheim, who wrote about the release as follows. I'm going to read another long quote from me, and he wrote, quote, "Suddenly a command is issued from the middle of the crowd. March in formation, and a battle-ready Jewish company of veterans marches in impeccable parade cadence through the gates of the concentration camp, leaving behind them the shocked and dumbfounded faces of the SS guards and the barely concealed smirks of the camp inmates. Even the noble knight Götz von Berlichingen could not have been a more suitable farewell," unquote. And if you know the famous the famous story of Götz von Berlichingen, you know what he's referring to. But whether this is embellished or not, undoubtedly this description was is certainly exaggerated in many ways. And when I came across it, I really wondered whether it was true. Could this really be? But shortly after, or not shortly after, a little while after, in a completely different archive, I found another prisoner from Buchenwald who wrote about the same exact experience, although in a little bit of more of a sober way, not as sensational as this. But this seems to have happened. The veterans, they got into parade formation and they marched out of the camp at Buchenwald. So their ability to withstand the wounds inflicted by the SS, their ability to endure these hardships, this brutality, all the while maintaining their composure and not to suffer or complain openly. This, according to the writings, this was a reflection of their character. And as they describe their ordeals afterwards, what comes forth is that they still describe the dominant traits of a soldierly identity, of remaining calm and composed in the face of intense pressure, this perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds, rising above adversity, and a refusal to succumb to momentary feelings of helplessness or surrender or defeat. This was a kind of Zangfleut, a glorification of perseverance amid an atmosphere of powerlessness. And it was precisely this. They defied the Nazis' efforts to strip them of their manhood, their honor, and their identity. And crucially, I think, by emphasizing the diminished coping capacity by emphasizing the helplessness of other inmates in the camps and simultaneously drawing attention to their own resilience. The veterans, kind of alluded to their own superiority. They described other inmates of men crying, and they elevated themselves. They put themselves on a higher level than the other inmates of the camp, those who hadn't served in the war. And the reason why they did this, I think, it was that their behavior, their reaction to the program, it was kind of a counterweight to the powerlessness and the helplessness that prevailed in the camps. And it was a means for the prisoners, for the veterans, to ensure that their ordeal during Kristallnacht would not be remembered as one of emasculation. The leitmotif, the common thread here that we see in all these and all these testimonies after the war was a narrative that preserves the legacy of Jewish heroism. Their accounts taken together, they were meant to convey that the Jewish former soldiers had not been broken, even though they were subjected to the most inhumane conditions imaginable. The Nazis had failed to break their psychological connection to their former status. And I don't think this was a final desperate act of self-delusion, a coping mechanism of being in control, even when you're not, was not this merely part of a survival strategy, but I think it was a conscious effort to preserve something, to preserve an identity, a sense of agency. And I'm going to end with a quote from Walter Tausk. Walter Tausk lived in Breslau. His diaries were recently published into English, and he was also a veteran, but he was not arrested and sent to a concentration camp. He managed to evade arrest, but a few weeks afterwards, the pogrom, he met a lot of his Jewish colleagues, and they talked about the pogrom, and they talked about what happened in the camps. And he wrote, quote, "The first 3 days were apparently the most horrendous of all. Only those who had the nerves necessary to endure them, and for the most part, this was only the case with Jewish frontline soldiers, were able to persevere under everything else," unquote. And this is the last thing I'll say. Looking back on this, looking back at not only the treatment of veterans during the pogrom, but how they described them, how they described their accounts immediately after the pogrom and years later. It's clear that the Nazi years had become a struggle for redemption, a battle to maintain their dignity, and a battle to reclaim lost status and honor, and a means to ensure that their sacrifices for Germany as soldiers during World War I, that all this had not been in vain. And I will leave with that. And I think I spoke probably a little bit too long. I hope I didn't speak too fast. And I'd love to have any questions or feedback, anything like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Geheran. You did not speak too fast, and you did not speak for too long. I always enjoy when I get to write a flurry of notes as I'm going and get to pull things. We're now going to open everything up for Q&A, and I do see that a number of questions have already come in through the chat and also through direct messages to me and staff. We're going to try to get to as many as possible. One of them is, I think, a really great question. Do we know how many Jewish veterans survived the Holocaust? And did you find, if this is even possible to know, a shift in their perceptions of their experiences? It sounds like you were able to see some of their accounts immediately after their internment. Did you see a shift in how they looked back on this time and the overall Holocaust years later after 1945? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is that's a really fascinating question, and I'll answer the first one regarding numbers, and that's very hard to pinpoint. But I will say that there were about 100,000 German Jews served in World War I in the German army in various capacities. This does not include the thousands of converted Jews, those who had converted to Christianity. It's only those Jews who identified themselves as such. 12,000 fell in battle. So by 1933, there were about 80,000 Jewish veterans living in Germany. This was a very rough estimate, about 80,000, maybe slightly more, but not many. Based on the immigration statistics, especially looking at towns like Würzburg and other areas where we have really accurate records, about half of them were able to immigrate before 1941, before all exit routes were closed off. So roughly half of them survived the Holocaust. Those who were not able to escape, those who were eventually deported to ghettos in Eastern Europe, and for officers and highly decorated Jewish veterans, they were deported to Theresienstadt. Almost all of them were murdered in the closing months of the war in September, October 1944. It was a tragic story, and not many of them survived. So probably about half the veteran population survived, the majority going to the UK or the United States. Your second question is the change in attitudes, and that's a really, really fascinating question, because one of the valuable trove of documents I used were the testimonies at Harvard University that were collected there in 1940. They were the result of an essay contest. The psychology department at Harvard, they wanted to know, they wanted to study trauma in survivors of the pogrom and survivors of persecution in Nazi Germany. So they sent out an essay contest where the winner of an essay, they would receive $100. And about 240 German Jews submitted their biographies and their CVs, as part of this contest. And some of them were incredibly detailed, and I would say the majority of them were written in 1939, 1940. So immediately after the pogrom, or at least several months, maybe a year or so after the pogrom happened, but but they weren't written during the Holocaust. They didn't know, they didn't have this gift of hindsight as to how things would turn out. So it's very interesting there. Many of the veterans and many German Jews in general, when they came to the United States, many of them had planned on returning to Germany after Hitler was defeated. They had notions that Hitler can't last forever, and when Hitler's gone and the Nazis are swept away, we're going to return to Germany. They had plans to do this. They were convinced that most Germans did not share Hitler's anti-Semitism as well. Of course, this wasn't true, but this was their perception. They made distinctions between the German public and the Nazis. This changed drastically after 1945, and we're fortunate. There were two other testimonies I looked at, both of them by veterans. They had their folder included in addendum that was written after 1945. For some reason, they decided that their first testimony no longer reflected their views and beliefs, so they sent a follow-up letter to Harvard, even though the essay contest was over. This was placed in the file, where they explicitly stated that I really, after what happened, I don't really have any desire to return to Germany here, the UK, the United States. This is my new home. So once the light of what occurred, once that became known, their attitudes changed drastically.
Wow. Did you find any evidence of an impact on the inmates, the non-veteran inmates? Did these veterans have an impact on them? Did they help with coping, or, in creating that structure, exercising that agency, even resisting in some instances? Did you also see that having an impact on non-veteran in people who were interned in the camps?
Yeah, really good question. And the answer is yes. I haven't found, to be fair though, I haven't found a pattern here that would substantiate that. I do have anecdotal evidence, especially for younger inmates. And again, remember, there were some inmates that were, 18, 19, 20 years old, who really looked up to the older men as father figures, as people who were calm when everything was going to hell, and they latched on to people like this. And there were at least two testimonies that stand out. One of them I mentioned here, where many of the veterans would sit down and explain that they had also faced these ordeals, and they would encourage them and tell them that it was okay, that eventually that they were going to get out of here, and that they would, in their words, this did make a positive impact. But two testimonies, obviously two is not a pattern here. It is a pattern in veterans' writings. They certainly saw themselves as being masculine role models, but that's a good point. This is how they like to be seen. This is how they want to be remembered. It says a lot about how about their own identity and how they want people to perceive them and remember them.
We have a fellow classmate, Dr. Sliwa, has a question for you.
Oh, Joanna?
Indeed. She asked, did you speak with any of the descendants of the veterans? And if so, were they able to share with you records and information that illuminated new things for your research?
Hey, Joanna, yeah, that was first off. Hey, Joanna, how's it going? I don't see your name here, but again, I'm not a Zoom person, so I don't want to click on the wrong button and have everything go disappear. But yes, that's a really good question. And yes, I did speak to many family members of World War I veterans. And unfortunately, I got into this research long after the last World War I veteran had died. So I was unable to talk to any veteran face to face. I talked mostly to family members, and they were relating to me stories that they had heard. Regarding their experience in the camps, I haven't heard anything about Kristallnacht. I haven't heard spoken to family members who describe the behavior of veterans in the camps or what they described during that day. I have spoken to survivors of Kristallnacht, but not ones who were family members of veterans. This information is gleaned that I presented with you today. It's gleaned exclusively from written accounts and from police reports. And again, I made a lot of use of the testimonies at Harvard and the Leo Baeck Institute. A lot of them, again, which were written immediately after the war. But yeah, families are valuable in piecing together information, sharing photographs, especially in sharing documents. Yep.
So I'm actually going to weigh in with my own question, because this was one that came up to me as I was thinking about this tremendous research, your book, but also the fact that every day you teach cadets now at the U.S. Military Academy. What is it like teaching this unique component of history to that group in particular? And do you note that they cleave to any of the lessons or your findings, certain ones over others? Do they find it to be formative in their own identity formation as they're thinking about their role entering into the military service?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that question, Sarah. Yeah, that's a really great question as well, and it's something I think about quite often. You know, in the way I see it, I'm teaching comparative genocide right now at West Point, where we look at a variety of genocide and prevention strategies. Next semester, I'll be teaching the Holocaust again. And when I teach both courses, my philosophy is that these courses are really about prevention. I mean, the goal is for cadets not really to go in and, for example, in my comparative genocide class, my goal is not really to go through a catalog of horrific events throughout history, one after the other, and recount this horrific detail of really the worst of humanity. But the goal is to learn about these tragedies, to analyze them from as many perspectives as possible, and to understand them, to understand how they unfolded, to understand why they unfolded, to understand who was involved, as they unfolded, who were the perpetrators, who were the people who kind of looked the other way and did nothing, who were the ones who secretly empowered them. Because by understanding this, I think that is the only way that we can prevent atrocities and catastrophes like this from happening again. So these are the classes I teach. Ultimately, the goal is to think creatively about prevention to make sure that they never happen again. And the audience, I think cadets are really in a unique position here, because although a lot of the classes focus, we think about we focus on upstream prevention to prevent it from ever becoming a mass atrocity, a situation from escalating in violence to begin with. And I think that's where the military is not crucial. But throughout history, in Rwanda, in the Holocaust as well, we see that militaries are crucial to both perpetrating genocide and preventing it. And there they are really in a unique position, because I remind them that this isn't, what we're talking about isn't theoretical here. This isn't a kind of theoretical exercise, that they could actually find themselves in a situation where what they do could prevent a mass atrocity, and that they have to start thinking about this now, unlike, because when it happens, they might not have time to ponder these things. So we approach this from the standpoint of prevention. That's the goal.
An important one and important work. I have another question. You talked about bystanders, actually, a little bit, those who choose not to take action. And I'm curious, did you have any findings about non-Jewish veterans of World War I and their actions as witnesses or bystanders, or perhaps even upstanders during the November pogroms and in the aftermath? I know you cited a couple of really important examples. The example of Julius Kutzmann is sitting with me, really just an incredible example of people taking mass action. But I'm curious about the people they served alongside. Those non-Jewish World War I veterans, did they do anything? Did they speak out? Is there any examples of them in particular standing by and being allies?
Yeah, really, really good question. And the answer is yes. And this is something that many Jewish veterans wrote about, especially in this large trove of documents at Harvard, the ones written in 1940. Jewish veterans, they talked a lot about help they received from comrades. During the pogrom, there were not just in Würzburg and other areas that I didn't mention, there were many times when somebody's house wasn't vandalized or they weren't arrested because one of their comrades was either a policeman or was even serving as a stormtrooper, and they said, look, we're going to leave this person's house alone, let's just go on to somebody else. That happened frequently. Sometimes Jewish veterans got a phone call from officials who were in the police or the government saying, leave your house and don't come back until it's safe. We've had a number of cases like that. And we also have several instances where veterans received help from their comrades after the pogrom. They were brought food, extra rations of food. They were helped. They were given aid in getting their immigration papers in order, and they received a lot of psychological sustenance too. By this time, it was one could get in trouble for visiting, cavorting with Jews, as they called it, by late 1938. So a lot of times comrades came by after dark, they snuck in, they would bring food and encouragement and sit and talk. And this seems like a small scale, limited action, but it actually meant a lot to the people who were in this position. So that happened a lot. And one of the reasons why that happened so often, I think, is because the German army, they had the recruitment practices of the German military were so that every regiment recruited out of a specific town. So in Würzburg, I mentioned there was a garrison. That was a 7th Infantry Regiment. It meant that all German males in World War I, for example, who lived in Würzburg, they served in this regiment. There's also an artillery regiment. So that means after the war, when they were discharged, you would see, it was not inconceivable to still interact with the same people who you served with during the war. You would bump into them during the 1930s still, and this happened. People knew each other. It was not just an abstraction. So yes, there was some help. Veterans were even invited to reunions, to their regimental reunions as late as 1938. Unfortunately, there were also, now this seems to be the norm. I think examples of, bad comradeship, of betrayal are rare, but they also did happen. There are one or two accounts that, I did read where a comrade would say, look, it's going to be bad for my business if we keep on interacting. So I can't greet you in public anymore. You can't come over and things like that. We need to create distance. So there was some of that too. But for the most part, though, veterans emphasized this help that they received. And this was fairly common, I would say.
That's, you know what, I think I'll close our Q&A on that somewhat hopeful and positive note. And thank you very, very much, Dr. Geheran, for an informative and interesting and unique talk. I am glad that you're out there doing this work and complicating the narrative further and telling this really nuanced and important component of the experiences of Jewish World War I veterans during and after the November pogroms. I also want to thank everyone who's in attendance. I want to again extend a very warm thank you to our program sponsor, the B'nai Shalom Foundation, Beth El, Congregation Torat El, and have a wonderful evening and take care and be well, everyone.